Hi, everyone. My name is Grace Richardson, and I'm going to be talking about the forced sterilization of immigrants in detention centers. So, what initially sparked my interest in this project and this policy research is in this fall, a nurse named Dawn Wooten quit her job at a detention center in Georgia and came forward with a whistleblower report dictating some concerns that she had working in the detainment center. And as you can see, this is a protest here on the left, and one of the protesters holds a sign that says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. I will cage, enslave, and sterilize them." So she is suggesting that hysterectomies of women were being conducted within detainment centers in the US. So I just wanted to do research to see what the probability of that being true is and some history and background and context, as well as if there's any policies put in place that would prevent that from happening or being illegal. So a little bit background on detainment centers. As we know, around 56,000 people are detained today, and the people that are in those centers are either in the process of requesting asylum, or they've been arrested for criminal behavior, or they're just even being suspected of being undocumented. And one of the biggest problems is that these private detention centers are mostly for profit, meaning that they're actually making money off of detaining these immigrants. So Mrs. Wooten, in her whistleblower's report, said, "I've had several inmates tell me that they've been to see the doctor and they've had hysterectomies and they don't know why they went or why they're going." So this is largely concerning. In this report, when it was released to the nation, drew about a lot of congressional support in favor of doing an in-depth investigation into the detainment center where Ms. Wooten formerly worked. Just a little bit of background about hysterectomies themselves. So they're considered a form of sterilization because they completely eradicate a woman's ability to ever reproduce in the future. There's a partial, a total, and a radical hysterectomy, but essentially it's the removing of a woman's uterus, their fallopian tubes, and or their ovaries, depending on the type of hysterectomy. And these are very hard to reverse because it's a removal of internal organs. So, a brief history on forced sterilization in the United States. As we studied the early 1900s, we learned about the eugenics movement and how nativism was really prominent during this time period. In the early 1900s, the individual US states began enacting what is considered to be called eugenic laws. And here's an example of the 1907 Indiana eugenics law. It says, by the late 1800s, Indiana authorities believed criminality, mental problems, and pauperism were hereditary. Various laws were enacted based on this belief. In 1907, Governor J. Frank Hanley approved first state eugenics law, making sterilization mandatory for certain individuals in state custody. So, Indiana was one of the first states to enact this type of law, which made it mandatory, and then other states followed suit. In 1927, a Supreme Court case called Buck v. Bell brought this issue to the highest court in the land, where it was ruled 8-1 that compulsory sterilization was indeed constitutional. Unfortunately, this has still not been overturned officially by the Supreme Court today. There's a plethora of examples, unfortunately, of where minority groups have been subject to sterilization, often against their own will or without enough consent being provided. One example of this is Native American sterilizations that occurred in the 1970s, and there's evidence that over 25% of Native American women during this time period were forcibly sterilized or coerced into sterilization that they didn't actually want, or falsely communicated that the sterilization procedure would be reversible when it wasn't, etc. And then here in the 2000s, between 2006 and 2010, more than 140 incarcerated women were sterilized in a California prison. And I'll talk more about this research later, but essentially what this slide demonstrates is that ever since the early 1900s leading up to 2020 today, forced sterilization is not a new thing. This isn't the first time that hysterectomies have been used to try and eradicate a group of people that certain individuals consider to be unfit of being called American. Here's a quote by one of the justices that ruled in the 8-1 ruling on the Buck v. Bell. And Oliver Wendell says, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So this is really representative of nativist and eugenic tones here, and we can see kind of how the US as a whole viewed sterilization during this time period. So what is the current policy? Where are we at today? I specifically wanted to look into the standards that ICE has, which are called PBNDS, which is Performance-Based National Detention Standards for all of their detainment centers. This is over a 400-page booklet, which details every supposedly law and regulation for these detention centers, as well as the people that work there. Now, on the Women's Healthcare Center aspect of the PBNDS, it's really interesting, the wording, because the ICE handbook says that the healthcare for women shall be in compliance with standards based on the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare Standards. So they're being held to the same standards that jails and prisons are held to. Now, when I dived more deeply into what the NCCHCS standards actually are regarding sterilization, they say that sterilization should generally not be performed because of work done by ACOG, which is really interesting language. Should generally not be performed doesn't at all say that sterilization of these people is illegal or unlawful. It just says that it should generally not be performed. And then I did more research into the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the ACOG that's mentioned, and their ruling or their guideline says only rarely should incarcerated women undergo sterilization. They list a lot of reasons, but again, there's not ever a clear policy that says this is illegal, this cannot happen, etc., which is really problematic. So with my literature review and my research, I really wanted to focus on the environment in which these sterilizations are occurring, and then the poor quality of healthcare that is occurring within that environment. So if we think back to the California prison that I mentioned before, where there was several hundred women that underwent sterilization procedures, a major part of my research was analyzing these cases afterward. It was shown that many of those procedures were undesired, and that specifically women felt pressure from prison and hospital physicians to undergo sterilization. So it's really interesting thinking about the context in which women are being detained. Their freedom is very much on the line, and one of the really problematic aspects is they feel like if they submit to the authority of the physician advising them to get the sterilization procedure, that's contingent on their release, or that will have an effect on how long they are detained or imprisoned, and that they could potentially be released more quickly if they adhere to the physician or the institution as a whole. Another really problematic aspect is just the poor quality of healthcare that goes on in these detention facilities. A quote from one of my research articles that I read says, "Women describe no formalized translation assistance, and few medical personnel could speak languages other than English." So it's really problematic if women are giving consent for these sterilization procedures and they're not even understanding fully what they're giving consent for. If they're signing a piece of paper in the wrong language, there's a lot of room for miscommunication and detrimental error here. And then lastly, just the overall maltreatment and lack of treatment for women in these centers is very alarming. There are several accounts done by the Human Rights Watch who did investigative research in these centers that found that women would request treatment for these women's health concerns, but then they would never hear back. So they would say, "Hi, I'm having pain in my stomach. I need to go to a doctor," and then their requests would just never be answered. And then another large concern was that several women cited that there was just not enough or a lack of like sanitary pads provided to them, which is really interesting because these detention centers are conducting these hysterectomies, which is a medical procedure and full-on surgery, but they're not able to provide menstrual pads to the women, which just shows a general alarming concern. So my analysis, I really wanted to look into the women that this is actually affecting. So Cohen states in her book, "Anyone who ICE believes is deportable can be detained." But what's really interesting is that the majority of these women that are facing this are migrants or immigrants, and largely those that are Hispanic and sometimes of low socioeconomic status. So it's targeting a minority population for sure. And I think that that's really important to make the connection between how that is still very much a nativist mindset and how everything stems back to both the eugenics movement and the nativist legacy that America has. The second point in my analysis that I want to mention is the detrimental long-term implications, not only the psychological implications of learning that you have had a hysterectomy, but the fact that this is something that can never be reversed, that these women are now been stripped from the ability to reproduce, and that they will live with this the rest of their lives, and that they're making this decision within a very small amount of their life that they spend in the detainment center that then affects them the rest of their lives. And then lastly, part of the analysis that I wanted to highlight is that the current deportations that are happening in response to the Dawn Wooten's allegations, a lot of the women in the center that she previously worked at that experienced these hysterectomies are being deported at alarmingly high rates, and the media and the public are concerned that this might be a move by the Trump administration and ICE officials to remove these women from the country before they are able to come forward and tell their personal stories about what happened to them, which is very alarming. So my solution, what do we do? Below pictured is a photo titled Detention Nation, and every black dot represents a detention center across the US. Which I think it's important to keep in mind. This isn't just Georgia, not just a California prison, not just somewhere in Texas or somewhere on the East Coast. This is something that is widespread throughout the entire nation. There's been several acts that have come forward, such as the Dignity for Detained Immigrants and the New Way Forward Act. Unfortunately, these acts, although they're very good-hearted and good-natured in terms of that they would improve the women's health care in detention centers, the problem is that they're so comprehensive in pushing for immigration reform that they only have a 3 to 4% chance of passing because immigration policy is so polarizing and controversial in the US. Getting both sides of the political aisle to agree to pass these acts is not very likely to happen. My solution and what I propose is that there needs to be a new clear-cut policy and law implemented that clearly states that sterilization procedures should not be allowed in detention facilities unless there's a medical emergency. If a woman decides that she wants to use sterilization as a form of birth control, then that operation can be done once she's released from the detainment center, but there really is no need unless there's a medical emergency for a woman to undergo a hysterectomy or any sterilization procedure while she's being detained. And then I also want to highlight that alternatives for detention, one of the best ways that we can prevent this from happening to women is preventing them from ever stepping foot in a detainment center in the first place. So that's something that we should really pursue as a country. And there's my bibliography and sources. Thank you.